Hello everyone, it's Douglas back here again, and in this video, I'm sharing some of the best advice on improving your creative writing under exam conditions. This video contains some of the secrets that I teach to my personal students. So if you're writing a short story, a chapter extract, the opening of a novel, or any other creative writing piece under timed conditions, then please take the following tips into account if you want to improve your results. Now the first tip I basically give to every single student. Keep the plot short. Now what I mean by this is that when you have limited time to write a short story, you need to keep in mind that you will not have the time to write a 500-page novel. Most students make the mistake of creating too long a story idea, so they either A. run out of time, or B. end up creating a story containing nothing but plot. Their story ends up becoming a recount of things that happen and doesn't show any literary ability. I mean, the whole point of creative writing is to show that we're storytellers, not historians. Now I hear some of you saying, but if our story doesn't have a plot, then it's not a story anymore. Look, obviously you need some sort of plot, but it needs to be very short and sweet because the focus of your writing is not on the plot, but on your ability to use literary techniques to create an effect on your reader, which is what you get awarded marks for. What I mean by this is that your story needs to affect your reader emotionally and intellectually. At the end of the day, a good story is the story that can move your reader. Make them scared, happy, hopeful, attached, sympathetic, or whatever other emotion that you want your reader to feel. A good story can also plant powerful ideas and thoughts into your reader's mind. A good story vividly materializes your written universe. And the way that you achieve these effects is by using your literary techniques, which again is what you get marked for. You don't get awarded marks for just telling us what happens in the story for 1,000 words, because at the end of the day, it's not about what happens in your story, it's about how your story is told. A very good example of this tip of keeping the plot short but using a humongous load of literary techniques is The Wish by Roald Dahl. I've included a link down to an online version of the story in the description. The whole story, spoilers, is just about a little kid playing The Floor is Lava, except he's trying to make it across a giant colorful carpet and he can only step on the yellow parts. That's it. That's the whole story, which is around 1,500 words. Even though it's a very simple premise, what makes it so good and widely studied in high schools is the way the story is told. The author creates a vivid picture of the child's imagination and the emotions the child experiences while playing this game through the use of different literary techniques such as metaphors, similes, imagery, emotive language, voice, and sentence structure. So I really encourage you to read and study how the story is written and the plethora of techniques used to create an effect on the reader. So to summarize, the first tip is keep the plot short. Why? Because you don't get marked for the plot, you get marked on your use of techniques for effect. It's the same reason why you watch a movie. You don't watch it for the plot, you watch it for the way the movie is delivered through the use of techniques. If all people cared about was the plot, then Wikipedia plot summaries would be way more popular than the movie itself. But it's not, because it's all about the way the story is told. And the way the story is told is through the use of techniques. That's what makes the story interesting, and that is what you get marks for. All this talk about techniques leads us on to tip numero duo, which is use your literary techniques. Now, I'm not just talking about your similes and metaphors, and I don't care about your he ran like the wind and she was mad as a bull cliches. I'm talking about using some advanced techniques to seriously improve your writing. You can't be using techniques you learned from your Year 5 bootcamp if you're in your final year of high school. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with similes and metaphors, but please employ a level of sophistication appropriate to your level of education. So, what are some advanced literary techniques I should use, I hear you ask? Well, here are some often neglected techniques and examples of how to use them that are key to creating an effect for your reader and bringing your story to life. The first technique I often recommend is imagery. Now, most people think that imagery is all about using descriptive language, similes, and metaphors to allow your reader to see or visualize your story. Although that's not entirely wrong, imagery is much more than that. It is about bringing your story to life, and as I'm sure some of you know, life is much more than just about seeing stuff. We also have 4 other senses. Appealing to our reader's sense of taste, touch, sound, and smell are all very powerful tools that can be used to bring your story to life if done correctly. For example, let's describe a princess using imagery incorporating more than just what we can see. The princess's gown was a magnificent royal blue color of the smoothest silk, which hugged her graceful form. Her earrings resembled fluttering fairies, and her bare, delicate collar presented the finest sapphires. As she glided past, a delicious sweet scent colored the air, which filled the hearts of her guests with an ardent adoration. Let's break this down and examine how I appeal to the different senses. Firstly, the description of the dress appeals visually to the reader's imagination, but also to the sense of touch when describing the smooth silk material. I think most readers would imagine a material similar to this. The physique and build of the princess is also alluded to when I describe her graceful form, her delicate collar, and how she glided past her guests. This is a visual and tactile description, as readers know what it's like to look and feel as if you're walking on air. I describe her earrings as fluttering fairies, shiny, majestic, and dancing from her ears. This is a visual metaphor. Finally, I appeal to the reader's sense of smell and the experience of how smells can be unbearably captivating, as if enchanted by a spell, which again is another metaphor. The alliteration here is just something fun I like to use as a writer and is part of my writing style. It helps to emphasize the key visuals and experiences I would like to convey to my readers. So by using imagery to describe our character, we are showing and not telling, which makes our story much more interesting. But more than that, we are also creating many different connotations which tells our audience who this character is without needing to actually tell our audience with words. I think this is best demonstrated by asking you a few questions about this character so far. Firstly, is our princess young or old? Is our princess ugly or beautiful? Do you think our princess is likely to be a good person or bad person in the story? If you answered young, beautiful, and a good person, then you have successfully understood what I am trying to convey to you without me having to explicitly tell you this information. All of this information is conveyed through this description because of the power of imagery to not only bring your story to life, but to also create these associations and connotations. Another important thing to note is how much we wrote just to introduce our character. Again, this places an emphasis on tip 1, which is to keep our plot short so we can spend more of our word count and time demonstrating our ability to use writing techniques. When you write, you need to think about your narrator and how they tell the story. This technique is quite complex as there are many aspects to narrative voice. But for now, let's focus on a few aspects such as the tone of your narrator's voice, which is how they sound like in your head, narrative perspective, and your narrator's values and attitudes. These aspects of narrative voice will change depending on who your narrator is. A good writing exercise to practice thinking about and using narrative voice effectively is to try to write about the same thing from two different perspectives. Here is an example of two different narrative perspectives on the same character. Everyone could pinpoint the exact moment when Trina arrived at the ball. She gracefully stepped out of the limousine, one leg at a time, and smiled. Her immaculate emerald dress highlighted her already perfect physique. Her emerald necklace and earrings twinkled like the night sky. She glided toward me as if on air in those pearlescent green skyscraper heels, flashed her pearly whites, and winked with an angelic charm, leaving me stunned before walking away. Every girl wanted to be her that night. I wanted to be her. Now for the second narrator. Trina's presence turned my laughter upside down. As soon as her foot emerged from that limousine, the herd of mindless sheep snapped their heads towards her direction and began to worship her as a goddess in a fancy dress and expensive jewels. After basking in the attention like a narcissistic dog, she stepped towards Stephanie, one of the new girls at the school, and winked at her. Later in the night, I overheard Trina laughing at how much of an eyesore Stephanie was and joked how she should have gotten her detention for her fugly dress. It finally clicked that a wink was just another one of her sick jokes. Now ask yourself, what is the relationship between Trina and the narrator? What does this narrator think about or feel towards Trina? How would you describe the tone of this narrator's voice when compared to the first narrator? Think about their differing attitudes towards Trina and how that paints a picture of who these characters actually are. From these two narrative perspectives of Trina and the same sequence of events, we can clearly show, not tell, but show who our narrators are as characters. This is done by demonstrating the attitude of the narrators towards Trina and through the tone of the narrator's voice when describing her. which is a very powerful and simple technique that you can use to improve your creative writing pieces. Setting is one of the most powerful techniques, but many students misuse it. Setting is not just where your story is held, but is all about reflecting the atmosphere of your story, reflecting who your characters are, and can even be used as a metaphor for what is happening in your story. It's such a simple concept of where your story takes place that can be made infinitely complex. To test whether your setting is meaningful in any way, try swapping out your setting for another one and see if it has a meaningful impact on your characters or story. If it doesn't have a meaningful impact, that means that your setting is meaningless. For example, if you swap out your quiet cabin by a calm lake for a busy city, and now your story doesn't work because you can no longer show a contrast between the calmness of the setting and the irate mental state of your character, then you know that your setting is important to enhancing the way that you tell your story. Here's an example of the beginning of a short story one of my students wrote and how we worked on using setting to enhance the tensions and reflect the emotions of the characters. It's your fault. I remember what happened. I remember what you did. Jimmy, please, I begged. All I ever wanted was for us to be a family. Just you, Irene, and me. Together. I've always loved you. I reached out to him with trembling hands. No, you haven't. The only thing you ever loved is this. He hissed at me, clutching the bottle in my hand like it was poison. He gazed into my eyes, then pushed me away firmly, backing me into the dining table. Mum would still be here if it wasn't for that. A flash of lightning and deep thunder sounded as he turned away and stepped out into the black night. He faded off in a hot gait as heavy raindrops thudded down on his scrawny frame. I slumped onto the ground, taking a well-deserved sip. That bittersweet taste was so familiar to me, and swallowing it gave me a sense of warmth I had not felt in a while. I reached over and picked up a picture of her. It was my favorite photo, Jimmy and her on his first birthday. The sound of rain drowned out my thoughts, and the moon and stars remained hidden behind thick black clouds. Although setting here only forms a small part of the passage, it is used to emphasize the negative emotions our characters are feeling and the dark themes emerging from the argument between father and son. What I really found especially effective was the use of sound of thunder following the son blaming the father for the death of his mother. This helps to emphasize the gravity of the situation and to help readers understand the wrath the son has towards his father. So remember, setting can mean so much more to your story than just where your story takes place. There are obviously many more techniques you can use, but these are just 3 of the techniques that I think are great to start practicing with. Finally, we have tip number 3, plan your story. Before we go into that, let me tell you what most students do when they're told to write a story. They'll think of some vague plot idea, setting, or character, and without even fleshing out their story, they'll just start writing it, making it up as they go along. And when they're done, I'll read through their work, and not only will the plot be terrible and be all over the place, there'll be 0 literary techniques. Any hint of a literary technique that ends up in the story is there purely by coincidence and doesn't have a strong effect on the reader. Then when they get a poor mark, they don't understand why. Luckily for you, that by watching this video, you're going to be aware of this common mistake and will know not to make it in the future. The reality once again is that you don't get many, if any, marks for your plot. The majority of the marks are for adhering to the prompt or question and using your literary techniques for effect. So, if you end up not using any literary techniques for effect in your writing, then you're gonna regret it, big time. So to get around this, we need to plan our story. If I get 60 minutes to write a story, you can bet that me personally, I'm spending 15 to 20 minutes of that time planning. Remember, it doesn't have to be a long story. Nobody said there needs to be a 5,000 word minimum. It just has to be well presented and well written. So what do I actually plan about then, I hear you asking? Well, you can break it down into 3 main steps really. The first is the characters and plot. I like to keep it short, maybe 3 characters maximum, and again, have a very simple plot. Some issue that the characters face or some event they have to go through that will transform them. You have to think about how the characters progress with the plot. There must be some problem or issue, and there must be some way that they at least attempt to fix this problem or issue. Think about how your characters will act at different parts of the story and how they will transform. What will the difference be between your character at the end of the story compared to the character at the start of the story? Step 2 is planning out your paragraphs or sections in your story. Think about it as scenes in a movie. How many paragraphs or sections will you have? What will happen in each section of your story? How many paragraphs for this section, then the next section, and so on. This will help you map out your story, cut out any unnecessary parts, tells you which part of your story goes where, and will also help you visualize how long it's going to take to write your story. Remember that we're still planning, so we can restructure and add or subtract to our story accordingly. Step 3 is to now think about the techniques you're going to use. Remember, we are not just going to start writing and by pure coincidence include techniques in our writing. We need to first plan about what techniques we're going to use, where we're going to use them, and for what purpose are we using them for, as in, what is the desired effect on our readers? For example, let's say we're writing a story about a character who loses a loved one and overcomes his grief. What techniques are you going to use to demonstrate the grief he is feeling? What techniques are you going to use to allow your audience to empathize or sympathize with your character? What techniques are you going to use to create the idea that losing a loved one can be mentally and emotionally exhausting? In this example, using narrative voice can be a great technique to demonstrate his grief and then his ability to overcome this grief. For example, in the beginning of the story, when he is dealing with his loss, the narrative voice can be melancholic, depressed, and hopeless to reflect the emotions of the character. As he learns to overcome his loss, his tone of voice changes to one of hope, optimism, and appreciation. So simply by using narrative voice and by changing it according to the key points in the story, we can allow our readers to understand and possibly relate to the changing emotions of our character. This is why planning is so important. By planning things out before we start writing, which is basically the equivalent of thinking before you speak, we can improve the quality of our writing and the impact on our readers. Once again, the 3 tips are: 1. Keep the plot short. This is so we can spend more time focusing on tip number 2, which is use literary techniques. This is not just how we maximize the impact of our writing, but how we can earn marks. The majority of marks are awarded for using literary techniques to create an effect on the reader. And 3. Plan your story. We need to have an idea of how much we're writing, what we're writing about, and what techniques we're going to use. By planning ahead, we think about our story and its completion before we start writing, which makes sure that we are using tip 1 and tip 2 in our writing. And that's it for this video. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe, and comment as it supports me and the channel. I'll also be happy to answer any questions down in the comments below. Thank you.
Hi there, this is Douglas here, and thank you for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to learn more, how about you learn from me directly, face-to-face, as one of my online tutoring students? For more information on the types of online tutoring services that I provide, please visit my website or email me directly. I look forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you again on the next video. Peace.